A card game is any game using playing cards as the primary device with which the game is played, be they traditional or game-specific. Countless card games exist, including families of related games. A small number of card games played with traditional decks have formally standardized rules, but most are folk games whose rules vary by region, culture, and person. Many games that are not generally placed in the family of card games do in fact use cards for some aspect of their gameplay. Similarly, some games that are placed in the card game genre involve a board. The distinction is that the gameplay of a card game primarily depends on the use of the cards by players, while board games generally focus on the players' positions on the board, and use the cards for some secondary purpose. Playing cards. A card game is played with a deck or pack of playing cards which are identical in size and shape. Each card has two sides, the face and the back. Normally the backs of the cards are indistinguishable. The faces of the cards may all be unique, or there can be duplicates. The composition of a deck is known to each player. In some cases, several decks are shuffled together to form a single pack or shoe. The first playing cards appeared in the 9th century during Tang Dynasty's China. The first reference to the card game in world history dates no later than the 9th century, when the collection of miscellanea at Ouyang, written by Tang Dynasty writer Sui, described Princess Tongchang playing the leaf game in 868 with members of the Wei clan. The Song dynasty statesman and historian Ouyang Xiu has noted that paper playing cards arose in connection to an earlier development in the book format from scrolls to pages. During the Ming dynasty, characters from popular novels such as The Water Margin were widely featured on the faces of playing cards. A precise description of Chinese money playing cards survived from the 15th century. Mahjong tiles are a 19th century invention based on three-suited money playing card decks. Similar to the way in which rummy cube tiles were derived recently from modern Western playing cards, the same kind of games can also be played with tiles made of wood, plastic, bone, or similar materials. The most notable examples of such tile sets are dominoes, mahjong tiles and rummy cube tiles. Chinese dominoes are also available as playing cards. It is not clear whether Emperor Muzong of Liao really played with domino cards as early as 969, though. Legend dates the invention of dominoes in the year 1112, and the earliest known domino rules are from the following decade. 500 years later, domino cards were reported as a new invention. Playing cards first appeared in Europe in the last quarter of the 14th century. The earliest European references speak of a Saracen or Moorish game called Naib, and in fact an almost complete Mamluk Egyptian deck of 52 cards in a distinct Oriental design has survived from around the same time, with the four suit swords, polo sticks, cups and coins, and the ranks king, governor, second governor, and 10-1. The 1430s in Italy saw the invention of the tarot deck, a full Latin suited deck augmented by suitless cards with painted motifs that played a special role as trumps. Tarot, Tarok and Tarocchi games are still played with these decks in parts of Central Europe. A full tarot deck contains 14 cards in each suit, low cards labeled 1 to 10, and court cards valet, chevalier, dame, and roi, plus the fool or excuse card, and 21 trump cards. In the 18th century, the card images of the traditional Italian tarot decks became popular in cartomancy and evolved into esoteric decks used primarily for the purpose. Today, most tarot decks sold in North America are the occult type, and are closely associated with fortune-telling. In Europe, playing tarot decks remain popular for games, and have evolved since the 18th century to use regional suits as well as other familiar aspects of the Anglo-American deck such as corner card, indices and stamped card symbols for non-court cards. Decks differ regionally based on the number of cards needed to play the games. The French tarot consists of the full 78 cards, while Germanic, Spanish and Italian tarot variants remove certain values from the deck, creating a deck with as few as 32 cards. The French suits were introduced around 1480 and, in France, mostly replaced the earlier Latin suits of swords, clubs, cups and coins. The suit symbols, being very simple and single color, could be stamped onto the playing cards to create a deck, thus only requiring special full-color card art for the court cards. This drastically simplifies the production of a deck of cards versus the traditional Italian deck, which used unique full-color art for each card in the deck. The French suits became popular in English playing cards in the 16th century, and from there were introduced to British colonies including North America. The rise of Western culture has led to the near-universal popularity and availability of French-suited playing cards even in areas with their own regional card art. In Japan, a distinct 48-card Hanafuda deck is popular. It is derived from 16th-century Portuguese decks. After undergoing a long evolution driven by laws enacted by the Tokugawa shogunate attempting to ban the use of playing cards, the best-known deck internationally is the 52-card Anglo-American deck used for such games as poker and contract bridge. It contains one card for each unique combination of 13 ranks and the 4 French suits: spades, hearts, diamonds, and clubs. The ranks are ace, king, queen, jack, and the numbers from 10 down to 2. The trump cards and knight cards from the French playing tarot are not included. Originally the term knave was more common than jack. The card had been called a jack as part of the terminology of all fours since the 17th century. But the word was considered vulgar. However, because the card abbreviation for knave was so close to that of the king, it was very easy to confuse them, especially after suits and rankings were moved to the corners of the card in order to enable people to fan them in one hand and still see all the values. However, books of card games published in the third quarter of the 19th century evidently still referred to the knave, and the term with this definition is still recognized in the United Kingdom. Since the 19th century, some decks have been specially printed for certain games. Old Maid, Phase 10, Rook, and Uno are examples of games that can be played with one or more 52-card decks but are usually played with custom decks. Cards play an important role in board games like Risk and Monopoly. Typical structure of card games: number and association of players. Any specific card game imposes restrictions on the number of players. The most significant dividing lines run between one-player games and two-player games, and between two-player games and multiplayer games. Card games for one player are known as solitaire or patience card games. Generally speaking, they are in many ways special and atypical, although some of them have given rise to two- or multiplayer games such as Spite and Malice. In card games for two players, usually not all cards are distributed to the players, as they would otherwise have perfect information about the game state. Two-player games have always been immensely popular and include some of the most significant card games such as PK, Bazic, 66, Clabberjas, Gin Rummy and Cribbage. Many multiplayer games started as two-player games that were adapted to a greater number of players. For such adaptations, a number of non-obvious choices must be made, beginning with the choice of a game orientation. One way of extending a two-player game to more players is by building two teams of equal size. A common case is four players in two fixed partnerships, sitting crosswise as in whist and contract bridge. Partners sit opposite to each other and cannot see each other's hands. If communication between the partners is allowed at all, then it is usually restricted to a specific list of permitted signs and signals. 17th-century French partnership games such as Triomphe were special in that partners sat next to each other and were allowed to communicate freely so long as they did not exchange cards or played out of order. Another way of extending a two-player game to more players is as a cutthroat game, in which all players fight on their own, and win or lose alone. Most cutthroat card games are round games, i.e., they can be played by any number of players starting from 2 or 3, so long as there are enough cards for all. For some of the most interesting games such as Ombre, Tarot and Skate, the associations between players change from hand to hand. Ultimately players all play on their own, but for each hand, some game mechanism divides the players into two teams. Most typically these are solo games, i.e., games in which one player becomes the soloist and has to achieve some objective against the others, who form a team and win or lose all their points jointly. But in games for more than 3 players, there may also be a mechanism that selects 2 players who then have to play against the others. Direction of play: the players of a card game normally form a circle around a table or other space that can hold cards. The game orientation or direction of play, which is only relevant for 3 or more players, can be either clockwise or counterclockwise. It is the direction in which various roles in the game proceed. Most regions have a traditional direction of play, such as counterclockwise in most of Asia and in Latin America, clockwise in North America and Australia. Europe is roughly divided into a clockwise area in the north and a counterclockwise area in the south. The boundary runs between Ireland, Great Britain, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Ukraine and Russia, and France, Switzerland, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Turkey. Games that originate in a region with a strong preference are often initially played in the original direction, even in regions that prefer the opposite direction. For games that have official rules and are played in tournaments, the direction of play is often prescribed in those rules, determining who deals. Most games have some form of asymmetry between players. The roles of players are normally expressed in terms of the dealer, i.e., the player whose task it is to shuffle the cards and distribute them to the players. Being the dealer can be an advantage or disadvantage, depending on the game. Therefore, after each played hand, the deal normally passes to the next player according to the game orientation. As it can still be an advantage or disadvantage to be the first dealer, there are some standard methods for determining who is the first dealer. A common method is by cutting, which works as follows. One player shuffles the deck and places it on the table. Each player lifts a packet of cards from the top, reveals its bottom card, and returns it to the deck. The player who reveals the highest card becomes dealer. In case of a tie, the process is repeated by the tied players. For some games such as whist, this process of cutting is part of the official rules, and the hierarchy of cards for the purpose of cutting is also specified. But in general any method can be used, such as tossing a coin in case of a 2-player game, drawing cards until one player draws an ace, or rolling dice. Hands, rounds and games. A hand is a unit of the game that begins with the dealer shuffling and dealing the cards as described below, and ends with the players scoring and the next dealer being determined. The set of cards that each player receives and holds in his or her hands is also known as that player's hand. The hand is over when the players have finished playing their hands. Most often this occurs when one player has no cards left. The player who sits after the dealer in the direction of play is known as eldest hand. A game round consists of as many hands as there are players. After each hand, the deal is passed on in the direction of play, i.e., the previous eldest hand becomes the new dealer. Normally players score points after each hand. A game may consist of a fixed number of rounds. Alternatively, it can be played for a fixed number of points. In this case, it is over with the hand in which a player reaches the target score. Shuffling. Shuffling is the process of bringing the cards of a pack into a random order. There are a large number of techniques with various advantages and disadvantages. Riffle shuffling is a method in which the deck is divided into two roughly equal-sized halves that are bent and then released, so that the cards interlace. Repeating this process several times randomizes the deck well, but the method is harder to learn than some others and may damage the cards. The overhand shuffle and the Hindu shuffle are two techniques that work by taking batches of cards from the top of the deck and reassembling them in the opposite order. They are easier to learn but must be repeated more often. A method suitable for small children consists in spreading the cards on a large surface and moving them around before picking up the deck again. This is also the most common method for shuffling tiles such as dominoes. For casino games that are played for large sums, it is vital that the cards be properly randomized, but for many games this is less critical, and in fact player experience can suffer when the cards are shuffled too well. The official skate rules stipulate that the cards are shuffled well, but according to a decision of the German skate court, a one-handed player should ask another player to do the shuffling, rather than use a shuffling machine, as it would shuffle the cards too well. French bello rules go so far as to prescribe that the deck never be shuffled between hands. The dealer takes all of the cards in the pack, arranges them so that they are in a uniform stack, and shuffles them. In strict play, the dealer then offers the deck to the previous player for cutting. If the deal is clockwise, this is the player to the dealer's right. If counterclockwise, it is the player to the dealer's left. The invitation to cut is made by placing the pack face downward on the table near the player who is to cut, who then lifts the upper portion of the pack clear of the lower portion and places it alongside. The formerly lower portion is then replaced on top of the formerly upper portion. Instead of cutting, one may also knock on the deck to indicate that one trusts the dealer to have shuffled fairly. The actual deal is done in the direction of play, beginning with eldest hand. The dealer holds the pack face down, in one hand, and removes cards from the top of it with his or her other hand to distribute to the players, placing them face down on the table in front of the players to whom they are dealt. The cards may be dealt one at a time, or in batches of more than one card, and either the entire pack or a determined number of cards are dealt out. The undealt cards, if any, are left face down in the middle of the table, forming the stock. Throughout the shuffle, cut, and deal, the dealer should prevent the players from seeing the faces of any of the cards. The players should not try to see any of the faces. Should a player accidentally see a card other than one's own, proper etiquette would be to admit this. It is also dishonest to try to see cards as they are dealt, or to take advantage of having seen a card. Should a card accidentally become exposed, any player can demand a redeal or that the card be replaced randomly into the deck and a replacement dealt from the top to the player who was to receive the revealed card. When the deal is complete, all players pick up their cards, or hand, and hold them in such a way that the faces can be seen by the holder of the cards but not the other players, or vice versa depending on the game. It is helpful to fan one's cards out so that if they have corner indices, all their values can be seen at once. In most games, it is also useful to sort one's hand, rearranging the cards in a way appropriate to the game. For example, in a trick-taking game it may be easier to have all one's cards of the same suit together, whereas in a rummy game one might sort them by rank or by potential combinations.